Okay, we'll go ahead and get started, everyone. Hello, I'm Christian Wade. Thank you for joining me. I'm a program manager for Power BI, and I drive enterprise features for scalability, modeling, and application lifecycle management, and things like that. We have Josh Kaplan with us today as well, and Josh has a mic, and I don't know if you want to introduce yourself, Josh?
No. I have a mic. There we go. I'm Josh Kaplan. I'm the group program manager for SQL Server Analysis Services, Azure Analysis Services, and Power BI Premium.
Yeah. So we can keep things pretty interactive. Either Josh or I can answer any questions as we go. All right? So the purpose of today's session is to look at enterprise BI, primarily in Power BI, but also in analysis services for scalability, manageability, and open platform connectivity. So we've got some announcements for some of the features, and we'll just discuss the vision. Okay? Does the mic sound okay, or is it kind of ringing a little bit? Not too bad? Okay. I don't know if you can. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Whoops, sorry.
Okay, is that a little bit better? Yeah, good. Sorry about that. All right, so traditionally, we've positioned analysis services for enterprise BI. So analysis services has a 20-year heritage. As Amir said, who was here for Amir and Arun's session this morning? Practically everyone? Well, not quite everyone. Okay, so as Amir mentioned, analysis services came out in what was then called OLAP services in SQL Server 7. That was like over 20 years ago. So we have a deep heritage in enterprise BI. And we're also, I think it's fair to say, the only one of the traditional BI vendors that really embraced self-service BI early on, and we built Power BI. So we are therefore, we therefore have a strong presence in both camps. We're not like some other companies that might buy some kind of modern BI vendors so that they can then claim they've got a presence in self-service BI. We don't have to do that. We're already like number one in self-service BI, in my opinion, and pretty much everyone's, right, as far as I can tell. If you look at the Gartner Magic Quadrant, or for example, I think they would agree that we are clear leaders. So as I say, we've been clear leaders in both camps for a long time, right? We're the only vendor to be ranked in the Leaders Quadrant for Gartner's Magic Quadrant for the last 12 years. So 12 years ago, self-service BI didn't even exist as a discipline, right? So that shows that we have a deep heritage in enterprise BI, and as self-service BI came along and started gaining prominence, we still kept that leader spot because, as I say, we embraced self-service BI early on. But now the wave at the moment is more around convergence and having an end-to-end platform for enterprises that is going to enable self-service BI users and still be integrated with an enterprise platform. We have an advantage there, given that we run on Azure and we integrate with the whole Azure ecosystem, and we have an integrated security model, and we have things like data flows that integrate with ADLS Gen 2, and we have good integration with SQL Data Warehouse, etc. All right, so we provide that end-to-end system, and we are well positioned to converge self-service and enterprise BI on a single platform, right? Because, as I say, we're Microsoft, we run on Azure, and also because both of our products, analysis services and Power BI, run on the same engine, because Power BI runs on the analysis services engine. Right? So we don't need to reinvent the wheel every time we enable an enterprise feature in, say, in Power BI, because a lot of the time that feature already exists and is already supported by the analysis services engine. All right? So even incremental refresh that we're going to talk about depends on partitions, and analysis services has had partitioning for 20 years. right? So that's just an example. Since the very first version, you could programmatically create partitions in analysis services, right? So we're very well positioned to converge the two camps, right? And to have a single all-inclusive platform that works for all business intelligence users. And if you look at the life cycle of a business intelligence artifact, it's not as clear-cut as just self-service and enterprise BI. Some implementations are just somewhere in the middle. Sometimes an artifact starts out as its life as an analyst making a discovery that then needs to get promoted to enterprise BI, and we want to be able to do that in a seamless way without having to reinvent the wheel and promote collaboration between the business and IT, all right? So any questions, comments, feedback, opinions, feel free to chime in. No? Okay, oh, yes, go ahead.
Power BI to me is basically taking Power BI and putting on analysis services. Is there a way, because I just don't know, taking Power BI, PBIX, and then transforming it to a service view?
There used to be. Unfortunately, we had to pull that for a long list of reasons that I won't get into now, but we will enable comparative functionality in a better, more reliable way. There were some issues with that because of the fact that despite the fact that analysis services and Power BI share the same engine, not all of the features are enabled in both, right? So quite often, new data sources will come through in Power BI, and then it's a ton of extra work for us to test them and ship them in Azure Analysis Services. That's why there's a lag, and they don't just show up at the same time, right? And that's why it's more streamlined, not just from the customer's perspective, but from our perspective, to just have one platform with one single set of tooling and one set of data sources and everything like that. So there were some issues with import from PBIX. We're going to do a better job with that going forward, and a lot of that will hinge around the work we're doing for XMLA Endpoint and converged metadata. Okay, so you'll see that coming forward, and it will work better. But unfortunately, there isn't right now. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead. I'll just take maybe. I'm going to probably take a break every 5-10 minutes and ask maybe allow maybe 2 or 3 questions and then move on. So yes, go ahead.
Yes, so we have an Azure Analysis Services Aggregate model.
Yeah.
And Power BI connected to using live query.
Yes.
And we're seeing a lot of performance issues because each visual slicer, what have you, has to make a separate query to Azure. And so the Azure Analysis Services is fully optimized and tuned, but it seems like there's an inefficiency in the way Power BI calls Azure Analysis Services to get its data.
So are you seeing, just really quickly, because we might have to take this one offline, I'm afraid, but are you seeing issues where the Azure Analysis Services server is just getting pegged because of potentially background refresh queries in Power BI, or is it just because of the visuals in a particular report?
It's wait time and sequencing.
So it's for a particular report, or is it because of background refresh?
Just one page.
Okay, yeah, so you'd have to go through, we have some, you'd have to go through and check the model and check the DAX queries, and there's unfortunately I'm not going to be able to answer that one now, I'm afraid. Okay, no worries, I'm going to move on and then we'll take some more questions. All right, so aggregations. Who here is aware of aggregations? All right, good. That's a good sign. All right, so we launched aggregations. We kind of introduced it at the Business Applications Summit last year, and then it then came out in public preview shortly after, right? And as you're probably aware, it unlocks petabyte scale data sets for clicky, draggy, droppy data analysis. And it works absolutely beautiful, and it does things that would otherwise be impossible over massive data sets, right? And it's very logical the way it works, and I can show you how to set it up in just a moment. So up until now, it's been in public preview, and the main reason for that was that it didn't yet work with row-level security, right? So if you had a Power BI desktop model, and you had aggregations set up on it, it would then disallow you from creating row-level security filters or vice versa, right? So we're pleased to let you know, pleased to announce that in the July desktop release, it will work with row-level security, and aggregations will then be generally available. So you'll be able to use it on enterprise models with row-level security, and you'll be able to unlock massive data sets in enterprise scenarios as it will be generally available in the July desktop release. So I'm going to show you how that works. That's probably the main kind of technical demo that I'm going to do. All right. So let me see. Who here has seen the trillion row demo? I mean, I've done it a ton of times, right? Clicky, clicky, draggy, droppy. Who here has not seen it? Oh my goodness. It shocks me how many people haven't seen it. So you'll have to wait a moment to see whether I can get it going. I've just done the keynote with Amir and Arun, and I will be lucky if we can get it going. But I'll come back to that in just a moment. So what I'm going to do, whilst that's loading, while that's running, I'm going to, let me just, sorry, apologize. So whilst that's running, I'm going to introduce the concept to you. So up until last summer, in Power BI, the data set had to be either import or direct query. And in analysis services, both flavors of analysis services, SQL Server analysis services and Azure analysis services, it's still like this, right? So the whole model is direct query, so it doesn't create any imported cached data. It's acting as a kind of virtual metadata layer, and it will take queries generated by users interacting with visuals in Power BI, and it will translate them to the native SQL constructs of whatever the direct query source is, right, at runtime, right? Whereas import, you would cache all the data into memory. So, and we'd use our in-memory column-oriented cache. We compress the data into memory. So import gives you blazing fast performance. Like, really, I think it's fair to say, I don't have any benchmarks to quote, and yeah, there are some specific cases where you need to optimize certain calculations to be efficient. But for straight aggregations, in my opinion, we have the fastest BI engine on the planet. But the problem was that for a large data set, you had to fit the whole data, all of the data into memory, right? And so you would need either a lot of memory, and it was a lot of management overhead as well, because you'd have to replicate all of that data into memory, and you have to use, you could use incremental refresh to make it easier, but you still had to manage that, right? So as of last summer, we introduced composite models. So this is composite models. There are different definitions out there of composite models. So composite models, as I'm describing it, lets us mix direct query and import tables in the same model. That's the base, the main thing. It also lets you have multiple direct query sources in the same model, but the one I'm focusing on is just import and direct query in the same model. All right? And so you could pick and choose which tables to import, which would give you a much better bang for your buck in terms of memory consumption. You could optimize for your executive dashboard, et cetera. You could leave like near real-time tables in direct query, so that you wouldn't need to refresh them. And then on top of this, we introduced the aggregations feature, which lets you create another table, in this case cells agg, which is an aggregation of cells. So let's say we take the sum of cells, we group by date ID and geography ID, we just get a few million rows in there instead of 10 billion. That's a lot easier to optimize, a lot easier to cache into memory, right? And now any queries that are generated by users interacting with visuals. So as users interact with visuals in Power BI will generate DAX queries to the dataset, which is an analysis services model under the covers. And then analysis services will, depending on whether it's in direct query mode or import. So if it's an import, it'll just get the data from the cache. So in this case, it's saying, I want sum of sales, and it's at the granularity that can hit the cache because it's grouping by year and city, which are tables that are this dark green shade to represent being imported. And then we then say, well, no, actually, I want to group it by customer name now, and customer is not at the granularity that can hit the cache. Right? Because the sales ag table is going to have one row in the geography table, but there could be multiple customers. It wouldn't know which customer to aggregate to. And it would just seamlessly on the fly revert to direct query. And the user knows nothing about this. Right? This is completely abstracted from the user. All right? The user just knows that they're getting blazing fast performance for the majority of the queries. And when they drill down to the detail level, okay, there may be a performance slight performance hit, but generally you would want that to happen in a controlled way, like a drill-through type scenario. And so, with BI queries, you're going to get a high aggregation hit rate because most BI queries are aggregated, right? And you can design this to really get good aggregation hit rates. Now, you'll notice that when I was in import, when I was grouping by year and city, the date table was dark green to represent being an import table, and then when it switched to direct query, the date table is dynamically switched to be direct query, right? So the date table has a dual storage mode. It connects as import and direct query. This is more efficient so that when it switches to direct query and can push that sum group by operation down to the source. It doesn't need to conceptually pull all 10 billion rows and join to date, because date can't be included in the direct query, okay? So date has a dual storage mode, which means it can act as both import and direct query, okay? Clear? Any questions? Yes? Yes.
Does date have to be of the same source?
Yes, the question was, does date have to be in the same source? Yes, it does. So it would be the same as if date was direct query from a different source. That would be deemed a weak relationship as well. So it's got to be from the same source for it to be considered a strong relationship. I actually have a slide really quickly to answer that in this one. Okay, so if sales was direct query and date was import, this would be deemed weak. It would not be able to push the sum group by down to the source. Whereas if we make date dual, assuming date is from the same source, it can then push that sum group by down to the source. So if it was from a different source, it would have to do a join on the Power BI side effectively. It would actually put a bunch of filters in the where clause, like an in-clause where filter based off the privacy levels in Power BI, and it would not be a strong relationship. So we need it to be a strong relationship to be observed for aggregations, right? And to be able to, and here's basically, as long as it's a single source, the table on the one side, which is typically the dimension table, is the one that's dual, okay? Any other questions? No? Okay. So let's see how we're doing. Yes, you can ask a question. Yeah. It sounds like you had an M expression that wasn't being folded, where it was pulling more data than was necessary. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'm afraid we'd have to look at that on a case-by-case basis. That, you know, each of the direct query sources has different query folding capabilities. The optimum is that it pushes as much of that logic down to the source, but there are some rules as to when it can and can't do that. There are some optimizations to get around that, but it probably take a while to get into that right now, I'm afraid. But yeah, it does also depend on the source. Like SQL sources tend to push that logic down to the source cleaner than other sources generally, but yeah, we'd have to look at it on a case-by-case basis, I'm afraid. Okay, so I'm going to just go ahead and just show you how to set up aggregations on a relational source, okay? And then I'll show you the RLS features. So you just give me 1 second here.
While that loads, is the new Power BI desktop going to be where you can choose your own color? Because maybe someone don't like that white.
Yeah, you could certainly choose your own color for the report. As Will showed in Amir and Arun's session, there will be theming, just like in PowerPoint, where you can just hover over and it updates, you know, all of the color palette, and you can set the fonts and everything much more easily. But for the frame, I believe that's going to be this gray now.
There is an idea of user voice to bring back both themes when you pick, so I broke that one up. I think I already looked at it.
Like Visual Studio, we can choose what kind of theme color we want.
Yeah, I think that's their intent, but it'd be good to vote it up.
Search for dark mode for Power BI. I hear 32 votes.
32.
These are pretty want to get fragmented out there.
Okay. So, almost there. I can take another quick question if you want. Yes, go ahead. Sorry, I could. Do you mind? Is there a mic? I can't really hear the person. All right. Sorry.
We have pretty large semantic models of relational databases, and one thing that has kept us away from tabular models or Power BI models is that we can't do complex joins. So is there any scope for you guys to include complex joins in the near future?
Are you talking about for direct query or import?
Are you talking about multidimensional?
No,
No.
tabular.
So you're already on tabular. You're not using multidimensional. Okay, fine.
For a composite key join and yeah.
Oh, composite key joins. It's
So-
on the backlog.
Actually, you know you can do composite key joins in tabular on direct query. There is actually a DAX function. Normally the way you do a composite key join in tabular is to concatenate the two together into one column, and then you do a join. That what you would do in import mode. It would work fine in import mode, it would work terribly in direct query mode. There is actually a DAX function. If you look up composite keys, direct query, DAX, it should come up. If you use that DAX function to concatenate into one column, it'll still look the same in the model, but when it actually goes and generates a SQL query, it'll generate as a composite key and perform a heck of a lot better.
Okay, we'll move on, and then we'll take some more questions. So I've got this model, which is a dimensional model. This is just AdventureWorks, in case you're familiar with it. And I've got this aggregation table. This happens to be populated in the SQL database, a pre-prepared aggregation table. And I just ran the get data wizard from SQL Server, and I just brought in these tables. Everything is direct query right now. You can see here that for each table, they're all direct query, and I haven't got any aggregations defined on this model at all, or on this data set. Right? So I've got a query here that is asking for the sum of cells grouped by year. Okay? And as you can see, it's running in direct query, and it's querying the fact internet sales, which is the sales table, which is like supposedly the 10 billion row table. Obviously, it doesn't have 10 billion rows in it because it just ran quickly. But imagine if it did, it would potentially be slow and require a lot of optimization, right? So the aggregation table is an aggregation of the sales table. If you imagine I just do a sum group by the foreign keys, which would be customer ID, date ID, and product subcategory ID. So I'm going to have many less rows in here, right? So I'm going to go ahead and just set up just one simple aggregation for now. And I'm going to say, these are all the columns in the aggregation table, right? You can just about see these columns here, right? And so these are the same columns listed here. So the sum of sales amount is just the sum of the sales amount from the sales table. So I'm going to set it up as the sum from the sales table of the sales amount column. And you'll notice I'm getting this message now. This is only in the July desktop release that you'll see this message. And it's saying that it will set the aggregation table to hidden for me, right? Before it was just a best practice to always set the table to hidden. In the July desktop release, it's going to be more than a best practice. I mean, the actual hidden property is technically optional, but if a non-admin user even queries the aggregation table, we use object-level security to make it not addressable. And a non-admin user cannot even query the aggregation table. Okay? We don't see a strong use case for querying the aggregation table anyway. So I'm going to come back to this in a little bit. But as you see, it's going to set the table to hidden for me, which is a good indication of the fact that I should not be exposing data from it directly to the end users. It's there, as you can see, it just got hidden for me. It's there as a performance optimization, right? Okay, so I've set that up. Now I'm going to go ahead and run the same query again. And I get back the same results, but this time, DAX Studio is nice enough to tell me that I got an aggregation hit. And if we look at the SQL that was submitted, it's actually getting data from the aggregation table instead, right? So the query, everything's still direct query mode, but the engine redirected to the aggregation table in direct query mode, okay? So if you think about this alone, even without import, is already very useful, right? You could optimize the aggregation table in your data warehouse or in your source system much more easily because it's going to have far less rows in it. It could even be potentially a materialized view. Like if you have near real-time requirements, you could have your materialized view show the changes to the 10 billion row table instantly without having to refresh that data into Power BI. Right? So it's really good for those near real-time requirements. And you can optimize it using column store, etc. A lot easier than you could a 10 billion row fact table, and you can design it so you catch the majority of queries with it. Okay? Make sense? I'm now going to go ahead and set the storage mode of this table to import. So it's telling me if I'm going to set this to import, it's recommending that I also set the related dimension tables to dual. So the dual is what we discussed earlier in the slides. So it's figured out the minimum set of tables that need to be set to dual. It's all of those on the one side of one-to-many relationships, either directly or indirectly. And it's offering to set those to dual. So if we just go with the default, then it will be fine and we'll keep the strong relationships that we were talking about earlier so that they will be observed for aggregation hits. Okay? And so, if I had like a big direct query model on a big database with 100 tables and I just wanted to cache a couple of tables, that Power BI Desktop would figure out the minimum number of tables to set to dual for me. Right? So it's useful for, you could argue that it's useful for Power BI tabular models because ultimately Power BI runs on an analytic services tabular in the back end, but it's not enabled in Azure Analysis Services and SQL Server Analysis Services flavors of tabular models. Yeah. So yeah. So that's the summary of it. Okay. Yes.
When the fine-grained data changes and the aggregates is different, do you have to wait for the refresh for it to reconcile?
At this point, I do, right? But when I had it as direct query, that's exactly why I called it out. That when it was in direct query, the aggregation table itself was in direct query. That could be based on, say, a materialized view or something that would be a lot easier to keep in sync. Whereas if now this is going to be imports, I'm responsible for making sure that I'm going to meet my business requirements and the data is going to be kept in sync in line with the business requirements. So if I'm only doing an ETL load once per night, it won't be a problem. If I have changes during the day, I may need to use row versioning or something like that so that the data is updated both for direct query and import queries at the same time. Okay? But so you do need to manage that. So that is a consideration when you have the import aggregation table. But this is going to be the fastest performance, right? Okay, so this is now import. And now if I run this query again, we still get an ag hit, but this time we got the data from import. So instead of a direct query, this is now a scan, and this is an XML query that it used to retrieve data from the storage engine. All right? And if I switch to this query, this one is not at the granularity that can hit the cache, because this is grouping by product name instead of by year. So just like in the slides, you know, one row in the sales ag table will have one row in product category. Let me just zoom in a bit because I can't even see it myself. We'll have one row in product category and many rows in products. It wouldn't know which row in the product table to aggregate to. So therefore, it says, sorry, I didn't hit the cache. And it reverted to direct query, and it's querying the big 10 billion row table. Okay? So everything's working as designed right now. And everything you've seen so far is the way that it worked in public preview and has worked in public preview until now, right? So except for the auto hiding of the table, right? So what I'm going to show now is how it works with row level security, which is the new bit, right? So I'm not going to go on. You can see that there are a ton of other DAX aggregation functions that work with it as well. All right. So let's come into here, and I'm going to show you the roles. And so we're already halfway, right? So I got a role here with no RLS filters defined on it at all, right? So, and I've also got another DAX Studio instance here, which I'm going to connect, and I'm going to connect as impersonating a user who's a member of AGS test. Hopefully this is going to work and I don't need to restart DAX Studio. All right, for some reason I need to restart DAX Studio. Let me just do this. Just 1 second. So I'm going to impersonate a user who's a member of that role, okay? And then we'll set some RLS filters up. Okay. Oh, that's the one. Sorry. In fact, I could just use the previous one. Manage roles, even though the model's called AGS Demo DQ, that's fine. Okay, so I'm going to impersonate a member of this role. And now if I run server timings and run this query. So right now, there is no RLS applied. I don't have any RLS filters, right? So I'm seeing the sales for all of the country region codes, right? Now I'm going to, oh, and by the way, I got an aggregation hit. This came from the aggregation table, right? So now I'm going to set up an RLS filter. on the geography table. So I'm going to say members of this role can only see cells if they're in the US. And the geography table, if you'll see here, filters the customer table, which filters both the ag table and the sales table. So this is the optimum setup for RLS. You need an RLS filter that can get to both the ag table and the detail table, and you'll see why in just a second. So I'll go ahead and do that. And now if I run this query again, you'll see that I can only see the cells in the US, and it's still got an ag hit, right? Because it said, I want to get the data from the aggregation table, but I need to be able to apply this RLS filter. Well, the RLS filter can filter the ag table and the detail table, so it was fine. So it got the data from the ag table, right? Now, this is where it gets a little bit more complex. You know, in most cases, or pretty much all the cases, this is how you would set it up. You'd set it up so that the RLS filter can filter the ag table and the detail table. But if you happen to set it up with a filter that can only filter the detail table, like something on the product table, cannot filter the ag table, then this is actually less sales than we saw a moment ago. This is sales in the US, but only for red products, right? We don't have the ability to see the non-red products. But now, it attempted to hit the aggregation, but it failed. And the reason is that it was not able to apply the RLS filter. If it can't apply the RLS filter to the aggregation table, so it would have been insecure to get the data from the aggregation table, right? And this actually shows why we've made it so that if you're not an admin user, so if you're not an admin user, you really can't even query that aggregation table at all, right? So in fact, here in Power BI Desktop, I can impersonate a member of this role right here. And now if I come to the data view, I can see the data, except if I go to the ag table, it says, sorry, you can't see any data in there, right? So a member of this role, it would be insecure to let them query the aggregation table. And so we've just kept it simple and said, if you're not an admin user, then an AS admin. So when I'm doing modeling in Power BI Desktop, I'm an AS admin for validation and for testing purposes. But if I'm accessing the data set through a role in the Power BI service, right, then I'm not an admin user and I can't query the aggregation table, right? Because there could be security issues if we allowed that. And if I now switch back to the modeler, who is an admin user on the local AS instance, now I can see the data. Make sense? All right? And the last case I've got here is, what if I have an RLS filter that can filter the aggregation table but not the detail table? So this one actually makes no sense whatsoever, right? Because, you know, the users can see the big sales table, but I've got another version of that same data in the aggregation table, which is secured, and they can't even access it. It just makes no sense, right? So we're saying, you know what? We're not even going to allow this. So there's a validation that says you can't even set this up, okay? And that's it. And this is the most complex part of aggregations, in my opinion, is how it interplays with RLS. You know, there are a lot of questions about, you know, we had to make a lot of decisions about whether we allow access or not, and we basically took the strictest approach because, you know, this is security and we take security seriously. So we've just taken a very strict approach to it, but that's how it plays with RLS. And 99% of the cases, you would be fine. You would just make sure that RLS can be applied to both the ag table and the detail table. Okay? Any questions? Yes?
Is there any way to produce a log, an entry of the RLS being applied on reports for like the cybersecurity team?
So the question was, is there any way of producing a log of RLS being applied when incoming queries come in, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So there is in analysis services, and in Azure Analysis Services, we have Azure Diagnostic Logging that provides that level of detail. This is something that we have on the backlog to introduce that kind of granular logging for Power BI as well. Once we have XMLA endpoints, which we're going to discuss soon, you could run SQL Profiler and check some events that way. But there is no equivalent of Azure Diagnostic Logging in Power BI today, which is what you have in Azure Analysis Services that gives you that fine level logging that you can keep all of the logs on your production instance for 30 days or whatever you want. But as I say, Profiler or something like that would work with XMLA endpoint in Power BI. Once that gets actually that already works. Yes. Any other questions? Yes, I'll take one question. Yeah.
Is there any plan on the roadmap to get aggregations into analysis services?
So the question was, is there any plan on the roadmap to get aggregations into analysis services? Not currently, because we're focusing on going the other way, basically. Where instead of, if we were to, we want to put all the analysis services functionality into Power BI to have a single all-inclusive platform. And any work we do going the other way means that there's some work that doesn't get done for our kind of core strategy, if you know what I mean. So unfortunately, not in the immediate future, okay? All right. Okay. I'll take, yeah. Yeah.
You're trying to go away. It sounds like you're trying to get it so that people are using Power BI as opposed to analysis services. Our company is using analysis services modeling and writing Power BI to hit it. That way, you don't have to have all these models that are linked to reports. You have a model that always hit.
Yeah.
Right? Less refreshes, less duplication of data.
Yeah.
Are you going, so you're going to be going away from that? Is there going to be a way to have Power BI model that supports multiple reports as opposed to having them integrated?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So the question was, and correct me if I'm wrong, that your organization uses analysis services to get the maximum reusability, that single version of the truth, that semantic model that gets reused throughout your organization, and you want to have lots of different reports, and maybe not even just Power BI reports, you might even be using Excel, and et cetera, to all get data from the same semantic model, right? So we definitely recognize that as a core scenario, and actually that already works in Power BI because we launched the XMLA Endpoints recently, which is actually the next set of slides. So that already gives you open platform connectivity from Excel and even our competitor BI products out there. Pretty much every other competitor BI product supports connectivity to analysis services because it's been, a market leader for 20 years. So all of those can now connect to the Power BI data set as though it were analysis services, right? And that already happens today. And then, like we showed in Amir and Arun's session, we've also got other features in that space, like shared and certified data sets. So I can have a data set in Power BI that is consumed from lots of different reports in lots of different workspaces now. So we are opening it up, just like analysis services. Okay, that's one of the core kind of scenarios for analysis services, and we are definitely opening that up in Power BI.
Would you recommend going forward for our company that we, instead of continuing down the path of building out modeling in analysis services, we do all in Power BI because your roadmap is going to say this is where our development and all our new latest features are going to come out?
Yeah. So that's also a good question. So you're using Azure Analysis Services? Yeah. So the question was, is it okay to continue working with Azure Analysis Services, or is that misaligned with the roadmap? So the way that, and Josh may want to elaborate, but the way that we are working on this is that it will be a clean lift and shift from Azure Analysis Services. Once all of the required features that you need, like open platform connectivity, that's already there. But scale beyond 10 gigabytes, that will be coming very soon. So, but if you're working on Azure Analysis Services because you need one of those features that isn't there yet in Power BI, then you can just keep checking. Once it's ready in Power BI, you'll be able to just change the deployment server name to the Power BI workspace URL, and it will work exactly the same. And we're going to even enable SQL Server data tools to work with Power BI Premium for those kind of lift and shift scenarios. Okay?
So one other thing, though, we're definitely still doing development. Turn the mic on, please. Thanks. We're still definitely doing development on Azure Analysis Services, and if Christian goes to the next few slides, there are a bunch of features that are coming out, and one was announced today. This particular feature is right now just not on the roadmap for Azure AS. It's held for Power BI, but there are other things coming there as well.
Yeah, and on that note, we've only got 14 minutes left, so I better get to these analysis services features. Okay, so then we'll take some questions at the end, if that's okay. All right, cool. So let's see here. Come on, PowerPoint. Okay. So we've already discussed that. XMLA endpoints, open platform connectivity, perfect segue. You connect to an analysis services server name using a variety of client tools for analysis services, management tools, profiler for debugging, and SQL Server data tools for modeling. You will be able to just do exactly the same, but with a Power BI workspace instead. All right? Thank you. So the read-only version of this is already in public preview. The read-write version that you would need for example, SQL Server data tools will be coming soon. All right? And okay, I'm going to whiz through these in the interest of time. So XMLA endpoint also gives you a very rich programming model using tabular object model. There's a ton of community tools out there that use it. And scripting, using tabular model scripting language, and PowerShell commandlets, all of that pretty much all of that will just migrate over to Power BI. And then we introduced Incremental Refresh, which I've discussed briefly. The deal with Incremental Refresh is simply that, I have a big model, like, 50 gigabytes. It doesn't make sense to, so that could be like 10 terabytes in its raw, uncompressed form. It doesn't make sense to refresh all of that data every time I do a refresh. I want to refresh only the data that has changed, right? So this is something that we've been able to do in analysis services for 20 years, but you'd have to write a bunch of code or scripts to be able to do that. In Power BI, we've just got it simplified to a little dialog that lets you pick your policy for incremental refresh. The first time you do a refresh after you publish the model, it will take longer to refresh because it needs to load all the history, and then subsequent refreshes are going to be much faster, right? Because it will only load the data that has changed, all right? And then calculation groups. So who here has seen calculation groups and heard of calculation groups for SQL Server analysis services? Not that many of you. Okay, so who here has used multidimensional SQL Server analysis services multidimensional? Okay, a handful of you. So multidimensional is a very rich semantic modeling tool. It only works for SQL Server analysis services on-prem or on IaaS right now. It's not the tabular mode. But probably one of the most powerful features of multidimensional is calculated members to reuse calculations in complex models, right? And so tabular hasn't had that functionality. So we've had to create lots of different measures for each of the calculations, right? And so we launched it for SQL Server analysis services in the CTP, so it's in preview right now for SQL Server Analysis Services, calculation groups, which is the tabular equivalent of multidimensional calculated members. And as of today, it is now officially supported in Azure Analysis Services, okay? So the tooling in SSDT still hasn't been done, and that will get done by the time that SQL Server Analysis Services 2019 hits RTM, or general availability. But in the meantime, there are tools like Tabular Editor, which is an open source community tool that lets you author calculation groups, right? And So the concept is, well, so it's going to ship in Azure AS as of today. As I've already mentioned, SQL Server Analysis Services 2019. It will be available in Power BI through the XMLA endpoint once we have read-write capability, right, that I already mentioned. And you need to use a new compat level, which is the 1470 compat level, which is currently in preview. So if you use an Azure Services Tabular, you're probably familiar with these compat levels. And the deal is that, you know, if you have a complex model, let's say you've got like 100 base measures, like sales and order count and, you know, reseller sales, and you've got a ton of these base measures. And for each of them, you might have some common calculations that need to be applied. Like the classic ones are the time intelligence ones, like year to date, month to date, 3-month moving average, year over year growth, you know, etc. So the way you would have to do it in an Azure Services Tabular and Power BI up until calculation groups is that you'd have to create separate measures for each of them, right? So for sales and orders, I would have another sales year-to-date measure and a sales month-to-date measure, etc. So you can see that it's going to explode the number of measures dramatically, right? And it's going to have this proliferation of measures issue, which is going to make the consumption experience for users. They're going to have to sift through potentially, instead of, if you've got 100 base measures and you've got 10 of these reusable calculations, that would be 1,000 measures that the users have to sift through, right? And the management overhead is obviously a lot worse too, because you'd have to manage 1,000 measures. Whereas with calculation groups, what you can do is you can define that logic just once. And as you can see, it looks a lot like how you would write a measure. Right? If I am able to switch this display setting here. So you can see that, for example, oh, it's just switching, sorry. Just give PowerPoint, there we go. So for example, if I zoom in, sorry. Okay, not sure what just happened there. Okay, not to worry. Oh dear. I'll have to reopen PowerPoint. PowerPoint is not my best friend sometimes, but not to worry. So the point is that you define those reusable calculations in a very similar way to how you would define them by creating a measure, but they are now reusable for all of the measures. Where's it gone? Here. Okay? And you can even override the format string. This has been an issue for Power BI for a while, that you can't have real dynamic format strings. There's the format function in DAX that you can use to return a string that is formatted, but then you can't use that in visuals that require a numeric type, right? Whereas with calculation groups, you can definitely do that. You can set the dynamic format string. So in this case, I'm setting the format of the year-over-year growth percentage to be a percentage, whereas all of the other ones, I don't set the format string, so they will inherit the data type of the base measure. So if I'm going to view sales year-to-date, it will show that as currency. If I'm going to view orders year-to-date, it will show that as integer or whole number. But if I view year-over-year percentage, it will always show it as percentage, right? And I define these once, and they're reusable for all of the measures in the model, right? And then the user experience is very simple, because the calculation group is presented as a table, and you just drag the column on, and it will just give, it will reuse those calculations for any of the measures that want to subscribe to it. Okay, so if I can just, so here I have one. So this is a matrix. I've got sales, and I defined that calculation group that you saw in the slide. So I've got the time intelligence calculation group with a single column called time calculation. It appears as just a table and a column to the users. They can just drag it, say, onto the columns of the matrix visual. And now I get all of the calculations applied. And again, I can use this for any of the measures in my model. I don't need to create 1,000 measures. So this is really useful for these complex models. Yes, go ahead.
Is
Yes, you could, it will work with fiscal calendars, and even non-time intelligence scenarios can use it, okay? All right. And just really briefly, how much time have I got? I've got 5 minutes. So, yes?
So is this Azure Analysis Services or Power BI?
Okay, so the question was, is this Azure Analysis Services or is it Power BI? So the calculation groups are supported in SQL Server Analysis Services, Azure Analysis Services as of today, and they will be supported in Power BI with the XMLA endpoint when the read-write capability comes in the not-too-distant future. All right, okay? And then eventually there'll be tooling for it in Power BI as well. You know what, I'd better run. I can stay behind. I don't have any commitments. I can stay for 5-10 minutes at the end, but otherwise we're going to run out of time because I've still got some other stuff to show, I'm afraid. Okay? I'd better just run through this. So I'd just like to show you really quickly that, you know, some other more interesting scenarios you can use it for, things like currency conversion. So if I edit this, if I bring in the currency name onto the columns, it gets converted to all of the reporting currencies, and this is not a string measure, right? This still works with visuals that depend on numeric data types, okay? Thank you. I know this has been a pain point for a few people. And I've only got 3 minutes left, so I'm going to whiz through these functions. All of this is documented here in aka.ms/calculation groups. There's a really good set of documentation there. And so the last thing I want to show is a summary of what's coming and what's new in Azure Analysis Services and SQL Server Analysis Services 2019. Right? So we just saw calculation groups. Many-to-many relationships are also being launched today. They're both on the Azure blogs as of today for Azure Analysis Services. Right? Many-to-many relationships, just like calculation groups, will be supported in SSDT by the time SQL Server Analysis Services 2019 gets to general availability. SuperDAX-MD is for multidimensional only. It means that it supports better performing DAX queries that Power BI will generate. All right, and we've got the new DAX functions, and then I'm going to cover the resource governance bits because there's one piece that I'd really like to cover. So the resource governance options, these are server settings on your Azure Analysis Services server and SQL Server Analysis Services. So you can set the client cache refresh policy to disable background cache refreshes from Power BI when you have, like your scenario, where you have a semantic model that is reused across like hundreds of reports, and then every time you do a refresh, especially if you do refreshes during the day, then every time you do a refresh in Analysis Services, Power BI will try and refresh all its tile caches, and it will bombard your server. So you can switch that off with the client cache refresh policy. Memory management helps protect the server from runaway queries and these big extract queries with millions of rows. And the last thing I'm going to cover here is this is brand new. We haven't announced this or let anyone know about this yet, but we are launching query interleaving in the not too distant future. And this will also be controlled by the Analysis Services server settings. So the main one that will switch it on will be called scheduling behavior. To really quickly explain how this works. Today, if you have very CPU-intensive queries for analysis services, right? And you need to know it's not all queries that take long that are CPU-intensive queries. There's lots of different reasons, but for CPU-intensive queries, you can have it's basically a first in, first out. So you have a query 1 runs for a long time. Query 2 and query 3 are submitted just after query 1 starts, but they have to wait until query 1 is finished before they can get to the CPU, right? So then they get blocked, right? Whereas with query interleaving, they will just share the CPU resources, right? The point at which all 3 of the queries are finished is exactly the same point as before, but queries 2 and 3 get to finish a lot earlier, and they get to share the CPU. That's query interleaving, and we're also going to do it in a way that is query interleaving with short query bias. right? So the default settings, there'll be some other server settings. The default will be, as soon as you switch on scheduling behavior, it will be enabled for short query bias, where query 1 has already been running for a while before query 2 and query 3 even come in. So it's going to say, I'm going to give a little bit more resources to query 2 and query 3 because I'm going to assume that they're fast queries. Queries are assumed fast until proven slow, right? And so the idea is that when you got a user on a Power BI dashboard that's submitting a ton of queries, most of them would be just fast queries, and we want to answer those without blocking them, right? So that's going to be query until even with short query bias. So all of this will be coming in the not too distant future for Azure Analytic Services, and we'll see whether we can get it into SQL Server Analytic Services. So thank you all very much, and I'll stay behind for questions. Okay.